In a city where power wears a badge, a racist cop trains the barrel of a gun on a sitting FBI director during a funeral. The gun doesn't fire, but the moment detonates a flood of truth, a citywide reckoning, and a chain reaction that asks every citizen, what does justice require of us when fear masquerades as order? If you're ready to witness a justice forged in daylight and courage, like, share, and subscribe to Acts of Depth, the channel that dares to ask how truth can remake a community. Fairhaven lay on a harbor that remembered every ship's horn, every wind that peeled salt off sea-sailed decks, and every rumor that traveled faster than a rumor should travel. The funeral for General Kaylor Dawn was a ceremony the city had rehearsed in its memory, a ritual meant to soothe a nation's ache and to remind the living of debts owed to those who put themselves in the line of fire for a collective future. The hall was a chamber of quiet, a cathedral of mourning where the living spoke in measured tones, and the dead spoke through the weight of their sacrifices. In that hall moved a figure out of place yet tethered to the city's pulse, Director Alara Kane. Not a herald of power so much as a curator of truth, Alara wore a tailored navy jacket that pressed close to a blouse the color of morning light. Her hair was pulled into a neat, practical style. Her eyes carried the calm of someone who knows the world has more things hidden than exposed. She carried her notepad like a shield and a map. The kind of map that shows you the routes a story will take when a rumor becomes a road you can walk. Across the hall, a silhouette of danger, Officer Dex Carver, stood without moving. A veteran whose presence announced more than years on the force, Dex wore his badge with a ritual pride. His chest puffed as if the metal would by itself declare him righteous. He believed in an old creed, keep order by any means necessary, and let the rest follow the formality of procedure. The crowd's murmurs did not escape him. He heard them as permission to take action. Alara saw him, saw his posture, and felt the old ache. How some policing is built on the fear of disruption. How fear can masquerade as protective zeal. She did not move toward him. She did not engage his gaze. Instead, she moved with the quiet steadiness of someone who has learned that true power is restraint, and that restraint is sometimes louder than a shout. The moment a gun's whisper cut through the reverence, the funeral's reverie splintered into something jagged and dangerous. Dex's hands found the weapon's cold, mechanical edge. He spoke in a tone that sounded official and certain, a language trained to persuade. This is not a spectacle of arrogance, but protection of what this city holds sacred. But as his words traveled, so did the echo of every time power had crossed the line, every memory of a person who believed they were defending something and found themselves facing a wall of consequence. The crowd's breath sucked in. A nurse in a quiet corner stitched the moment together with a memory she did not want to own. A bystander gripped a railing and whispered a prayer. An old man who'd once served in a distant theater of conflict clutched his wife's hand and asked quietly if the ends could ever justify such means. The room wasn't sure what to do, but every heart knew it could not let fear dictate the next breath. Then came a ripple. The lifeline of leadership arrived, not with a thunderclap, but with a careful, heavy-footed step. Chief Orion Hale, a man whose face bore the lines of patience earned under pressure, moved with that methodical gravity that marks a veteran who refuses to let the moment collapse into itself. He didn't rush to the front. He stepped to the side of the gun so the audience could see the consequence of error without surrendering hope. He placed his hand gently between the gun's line of fire and the crowd, giving the room to breathe. Dex looked up, his mouth moving as if to respond, but Hale's eyes cut him off, not with a glare, but with the weight of unspoken expectation. The chief didn't tell the crowd to calm down. He urged them to trust that the truth would be visible soon enough. He asked Kane to step forward, to testify not from the stance of a prosecutor, but from the posture of a citizen who lives within a city that has learned the hard way that accountability is not a performance, but a duty. The gun fell silent as Dex's breath shortened. The crowd's tension remained, but the energy shifted from fear to a shared willingness to confront what lay beneath. The port's rhythm synchronized with the beating of a city's heart. The tremor before truth, the pause before a reckoning. The moment when the quiet voice of a single agent becomes the catalyst for a hurricane of change. The day wore on, and the crowd's attention moved toward a different face that wasn't visible at the funeral's start. A dock worker named Matteo who could tell a story with a single word and a single gesture. He stepped forward with a battered megaphone, his voice thick with memory and resolve. He reminded the room that fear can be a weapon and a shield, and that courage is often just showing up to be counted when the cost is personal safety. The crowd listened, their silence becoming a thread binding the city's next steps. As the sun moved west and the shadows lengthened, the chief's movement crystallized the city's question into a plan. He did not demand a verdict, he demanded a process. He announced this would be the moment where an investigation would unfold with radical transparency, where every step would be shared publicly, where a civilian oversight board would be formed to ensure that the future would be safe from the old habits of silence. The crowd, previously uncertain, breathed a cautious relief. The first act of consequence came when the badge fell from Dex's chest with a click and a dull thud against the marble floor. The crowd gasped. Some turned away from the sight. Others looked on with a mixture of fear and vindication. This was a symbol not of cruelty broken from without, but cruelty broken from within. A symbol that the city would no longer permit its protectors to be a threat to the people they were sworn to guard. Alara stepped into the light in a way she hadn't yet allowed herself to do in a public setting. She spoke with measured gravity about what she observed, what her investigations would uncover, and what this meant for the city's future. She didn't insist on certainty. She offered a map of what was to come, a series of steps that would reveal the pattern of corruption, the chains that had bound an entire system for far too long. The crowd listened, not with blind faith, but with the vigilance of people who know that justice is rarely a thunderclap. It's a careful stitching of truth, a patient uncovering of the small lies that become big ones, the incremental acts that break the back of fear. The harbor's fog gave way to a brighter day, and a city suddenly found itself in the space between outrage and reform, where courage anchors the future rather than anchors the past. So begins the long work of the investigation, where every breadcrumb matters and every voice is heard. The truth would be more than a moment. It would be a lasting call to action. It would become a blueprint for the city's transformation, not a rumor to be erased at the whim of power. The day's events would become a memory the city would hold dear, not to punish, but to empower. Would you like part 4 to continue now? The next section will move from the courtroom into the city's living rooms, schools, and workplaces, showing how accountability reshapes the daily lives of ordinary people and the institutions that serve them. The verdict's echo lingered in Fairhaven like a bell after a storm, a sound that did not fade but settled into the city's bones as a new rhythm. The day after the courthouse cleared its throat with a formal sentence, the city began real work, a blueprint for living differently, a map for repairing the cracks that fear had blown open. Calder walked the harbor promenade, the sun bright on the water, and allowed herself a moment of quiet calculation. This was no victory parade, it was a starting line. The first step, Hale insisted, would be transparency. A civilian oversight board would be empowered to scrutinize every corner of the department, from use of force policies to recruitment practices, from complaint channels to the cadence of internal investigations. The board would be a mosaic of voices, a retired nurse who had soothed patients through chaotic nights, a teacher who had watched students learn to speak up, a student journalist who had learned to ask the hard questions, and a small business owner who had watched contracts bend to fear. Isla knew the weight of that task. She also knew the city would not tolerate hollow promises again. In the weeks that followed, the board convened in a sunlit conference room overlooking the harbor. The room was bright, its walls white and clean, a stark contrast to the shadowy corners of the city the board sought to illuminate. The nurse spoke of trauma-informed care. The teacher spoke of safe spaces in schools. The journalist spoke of reporting with both skepticism and fairness. The small business owner spoke of accountability and procurement, of contracts that should serve communities rather than drain them. Their voices formed a chorus that could no longer be silenced by fear. At the same time, the department redesigned its training regime. A cadre of instructors, portside paramedics, trauma counselors, Veteran officers who had learned humility the hard way led sessions in de-escalation, bias recognition, and active listening. The sessions were not dry lectures, they were lived experiments with role plays, reflective debriefs, and moments that forced officers to witness the lives on the other side of the badge. The city watched these changes with a mix of skepticism and cautious hope, as if every citizen held their breath while a fragile bridge was being mended. Brant Lear's arc, once a symbol of what power becomes when unmasked, unfolded in a slower, more human fashion than a courtroom drumbeat. He agreed to therapy, not because a judge commanded it, but because a former mentor pressed him to look at the way fear had shaped his choices. He began to listen to families who had endured coercion, to the parents who feared when they spoke, to the workers who felt their voices dissolving into silence. The process was not easy, but it offered him a weathered kind of hope, the possibility that even the most broken habits could be unmade with time and honesty. The whistleblower Noor Sarin, whose careful documents had become the scaffolding of a broader rebuild, emerged as a guiding light in this new era. Noor didn't seek the limelight. She sought the light. She conducted workshops on whistleblower protections, mentoring a new generation of truth-tellers who understood that courage often begins as a whisper and becomes a chorus. Her presence in town life grew from rumor to a trusted resource, and the people began to believe again that truth, when voiced, could reshape a city's destiny. Meanwhile, the city's heart, its everyday people, began to feel the shift in a tangible way. The docks hummed with a different cadence. The ships came and went with less quiet fear, more confident rhythm. The food stalls and small shops offered reminders of communal resilience. A neighbor's home-cooked meals for the weary, a local market that offered a fair price for those who had little, and a library that opened its doors wider to all ages and backgrounds. The city's daily life grew into a living testimony to the belief that accountability, when embraced, can become nourishment. Isla Calder's leadership grew not from a single act of courage, but from a daily practice of listening and testing assumptions. She launched a mentorship program for junior investigators, some fresh from academy halls, others seasoned by years of quiet complicity, teaching them to walk the line between skepticism and empathy. She reminded them, and herself, that the truth is not a weapon, but a responsibility, to wield with care, to protect the vulnerable, and to repair what harm has already occurred. The city's cultural life followed suit. A new festival emerged, a day of dignity, a weekend when stories of resilience, told by mothers who fought for their children, by workers who stood up against coercion, by veterans who refused to surrender their humanity, took center stage. The festival did not erase the past, it sifted it, turning pain into a shared resolve. The stage was set for a future where public memory and public policy walked in step. The courtroom, though quiet now, retained its weathered gravity as a constant reminder of what accountability costs and what redemption requires. The judge who presided over the landmark case, Judge Aria Solstice in the earlier chapters, remained a living symbol of integrity. She offered counsel to younger jurists, encouraging them to hold space for the complexity of real lives, the way fear and hope can collide, the way a single moment can pivot a city toward justice or away from it. But not every thread in the city's tapestry found a clean seam. A few voices insisted the reforms went too far, that the city was sliding toward punitive excess, that the memory of pain could become a justification for suspicion. Isla, however, listened to both sides with patience, weaving their concerns into the broader plan. The Civilian Oversight Board stood as a guardrail, not a prison, ensuring reform without cruelty and accountability without vengeance. In the end, the city's new normal bore the weight and warmth of a place that refused to forget, but refused to fear. The harbor glowed with a renewed sense of safety. The streets felt safer because they were watched and improved. The schools taught with more empathy and more honesty. The families found the courage to seek help without suspicion. The city was not perfect, but it was alive to its responsibilities, a living organism reimagining what justice could be. As the season shifted toward a new year, the city opened its doors wider to those who sought sanctuary. Whistleblowers, families escaping violence, workers seeking better wages, teachers who wanted to heal the classroom climate. The city's institutions began to thrive on a shared premise. Every citizen mattered, every voice deserved to be heard, and every misstep could become a learning opportunity in the hands of a community that still believed in redemption. But the more hopeful the city grew, the more important the individual became. The stories of the dock worker who spoke truth to power, the nurse who protected patients at the risk of her own job, the student who asked a problem of policy that changed how the city allocated resources, all of them became a chorus of everyday heroes. Their courage did not vanish in a courtroom. It lived on in every call for accountability, in every act of kindness, and in every quiet decision to do what is right, even when it is hard. The Part 4 arc ends not with a dramatic crescendo, but with a quiet continuity, ongoing reforms, daily acts of courage, and a city learning to live with a future shaped by honesty, care, and shared power. The harbor's light grows brighter, the courthouse grounds hum with new life, and the people walking the streets carry a renewed sense of purpose. The city has chosen a path of healing, and the path is long, but also necessary. The courtroom verdict sent ripples that reached every corner of Fairhaven, slow and widening like tides turning the harbor from gray to hopeful. News crews still lingered outside the courthouse, but the city was moving in a different current now toward clarity, accountability, and a shareable blueprint for living with integrity. Isla Calder walked the boardwalk at dawn, her bag light, her mind heavy with the work ahead. The city wanted more than reflection. It wanted a plan people could grasp and actions people could follow. In the weeks after, the Civilian Oversight Board began its deliberate work. The panel was a mosaic. Dr. Noor Sarin, a physician who had risked her license to speak truth, Kai Turner, a community organizer whose energy could mobilize neighbors into action, Marta Alvarez, a small business owner who had learned to navigate red tape with resilience, and Lena Khan, a trauma therapist who understood how fear replays in bodies long after a crisis. They listened first, asked questions second, and spoke with the calm authority of people who had lived through silences that robbed them of voice. Noor's role was not to punish, but to guide the reconstruction of trust. She sat with Isla in a room full of witnesses, mapping how fear had embedded itself in the system's memory, how whistleblowers were once silenced, and how the wounded learned to swallow their stories rather than risk retaliation. Noor carried a quiet grace, the kind that showed itself in the soft lines around her eyes when she spoke of pain, and in the precise way she drew a line across a chart to indicate where fear ended and accountability began. The room leaned in, not to criticize, but to absorb a blueprint of courage. Kai Turner's energy became a lifeblood in these meetings. He pushed for neighborhood listening sessions, a new cadence for City Hall that invited voices too easily drowned out. The single mother who couldn't afford a sitter, the immigrant worker who feared reporting harassment, the student who believed the system would never hear him. Kai's speeches carried a rhythm that felt like marching drums in a parade of possibility. He drew maps on whiteboards, turning abstract policies into street-level steps, dedicated hours for dialogue, guaranteed channels for complaint, swift responses to concerns, and transparent progress reports that never faded from view. Marta Alvarez, whose corner shop had warmed the winter with its lights and smiles, pressed for procurement fairness and community-focused contracts. She spoke of how a city's prosperity should pass through the hands of its own people, not siphon into distant pockets. Her shop's bell rang when she made a point, a sound that reminded everyone that small acts of enterprise often carry the moral heft of grand policy. She became a living example of how economic dignity and social dignity walk side by side. Lena Khan, a trauma therapist who had learned through patients and families what resilience looks like when fear has worn its shape into the chest, brought a different lens to the table. She insisted that reforms must address the body as well as the mind, de-escalation training that recognizes trauma responses, safe spaces in schools and clinics, escalation protocols that protect caregivers and communities alike. Her charts, color-coded and careful, mapped how restorative care could prevent spirals before they began. Meanwhile, the city's daily life began to reflect the changes. The harbor's rhythm altered as trust returned to the docks. A crane operator who once avoided eye contact now nodded to a dock worker who used to fear him. A shop owner who once dodged questions agreed to partner with a neighbor-run food bank. The ripple was not abstract, it was concrete, tangible, measurable in time saved, lives stabilized, and income shielded from predatory contracts. People who had suffered in the shadows found their voices in the sunlight. Isla Calder's leadership deepened as she supervised the cascade of reforms. She reminded the board and the city that accountability without mercy is brittle, yet mercy without accountability is a dream that dissolves under pressure. She anchored the reforms in daily practice, a public use of force portal that recorded every incident, training that embraced cultural humility and empathy as core competencies, and independent audits that flagged risk before harm became a headline. The city's memory was turning into a living policy manual, and it felt surprisingly light to carry. Brant Lear's journey moved at a slower tempo, like a river bending through stone. He found himself in therapy rooms, in listening circles, in conversations with families he'd once dismissed. He spoke of fear, fear of losing status, fear of admitting fault, fear of a future where his control had nothing to lean on but pride. The work didn't erase his past, but it started eroding the walls that had kept him isolated inside a badge. He spoke softly now, admitting what he'd done and seeking a path toward repair. Noor's voice carried through every corridor, a steady beacon. She reminded colleagues that truth must be defended not with vengeance, but with compassion that shapes policy. She organized neighborhood support groups to empower those who had once whispered for fear of retribution. She trained younger doctors and public servants to recognize the signs of systemic harm so they could intervene with care before cynicism hardens into paralysis. The city's transformation was not perfect. Pockets of resistance persisted, as they always would in any living system. There were debates about the pace of reform, about how quickly the city should uproot itself from old habits, and about whether the civilian board could maintain independence under political pressure. Yet the prevailing mood was clear. People were choosing engagement over silence, and courage over cynicism. The media began to shift as well. Reporters who once chased sensational headlines undercut moral narratives by focusing on the human stakes, on the families and workers whose lives had become a chorus demanding honesty. The city's stories, once treated as scare-slick, were now treated as nuanced, layered portraits of a population learning to balance justice with mercy. The tone changed, the urgency matured, and the public learned to demand integrity as a daily ritual. One evening, the harbor lanterns lit a path along the promenade. Isla walked with Lena along the water, speaking of the long road ahead and the patience required to sustain change. Lena asked about the cost of healing, whether it demanded a kind of ongoing sacrifice. Isla replied that healing was a practice, not a price. It required daily choices to stay true to the vulnerable who still needed a voice. As autumn gave way to winter, the ripple stretched into schools, clinics, and council chambers across the region. The city's renewal seeds grew in unlikely places. A teacher who redesigned curricula to highlight civics and empathy. A nurse who implemented trauma-informed care across clinics. A family clinic that offered sliding-scale services to the uninsured. The people began to see themselves as part of a shared project rather than isolated survivors, and the project saw them in return. The final act of Part 5 lingered in the air as the city prepared for a second wave of accountability, this time farther afield than Fairhaven. The civilian board organized a regional summit to share lessons learned, and a coalition of communities joined in toward a common aim, a national standard for compassionate policing, a front of transparency that could outpace any protest, any lobbyist, or any political maneuver. The harbor glowed brighter, and the skyline seemed to exhale in relief. If you'd like, I can continue with Part 6, Epilogue, the real victory, and then help you format this entire 6-section narrative into a screenplay or a publish-ready YouTube script, complete with voiceover cues, scene directions, and shot-by-shot suggestions. The final chapter begins not with a blaze, but with a dawn. It is the 10th anniversary of the day the harbor learned what accountability feels like, when power falters and truth remains standing. The city hosts a day of justice and healing, under a pale sun that turns the water to glass. A day when doors that once slammed shut open with a cautious welcome. Isla Calder stands at the edge of the pier, a quiet figure with a lifetime of questions stitched into her gaze. The crowd gathers, not to celebrate a victory, but to honor a turning point where courage became a daily practice rather than a borrowed spark. The harbor breathes as she speaks, not to remind the city of the past, but to invite it toward a future hammered into shape by daily acts of restraint and mercy. She talks about the moments when fear rose up and demanded obedience, and how, over time, the city learned to slow down, to listen, to follow a path that favored repair over retribution. She doesn't gloss over the pain or pretend that the echoes of that terrible day have faded. She invites them to be transformed into resolve. The audience feels the gravity of a city choosing to grow up together, instead of letting pain become a lifetime sentence. In the front row, Noor Sarin sits with the air of someone who has learned that truth is a public good, not a private victory. Noor's hands rest on a notebook filled with the signatures of neighbors who testified, the signatures of doctors who defended patient care, the signatures of students who refused to stay silent. She has grown into an elder of reform, a beacon who shows that you don't have to be loud to be heard, and you don't need a throne to shape policy. The crowd leans in as she speaks softly of protections for whistleblowers and the steady, patient work of rebuilding trust. Beside Noor sits Kai Turner, a community organizer whose presence is a drumbeat of energy. He has learned to translate bold promises into practical steps, listening sessions in every neighborhood, translation services so no voice is lost, and a schedule of town halls that makes courage accessible to those who have never felt brave enough to raise their hands. Kai's speech is not a fireworks display, but a sprint through a marathon, urging everyone to stay the course when cynicism reappears, because persistence is the real victory. Marta Alvarez, who once watched power lean on fear and bend the community to its will, now sits with a ledger in her hands. Her business, once a symbol of the city's uneven prosperity, has become a model of inclusive procurement. She speaks about contracts that shape lives, about small startups that could feed families rather than feed a few prestige pockets. Her voice is practical and hopeful, a reminder that justice is not only legal but economic, not just punitive, but restorative. Lena Khan, a trauma therapist who once watched fear erupt in the bodies of children and the hearts of mothers, stands to share a new approach to safety. She outlines trauma-informed policies for schools and clinics, an approach that treats fear not as a failure, but as a signal, a map that shows where care is needed most. Her words land like measured, careful rain on thirsty ground, promising relief for those who carry unseen wounds. The crowd's energy has shifted from cautious listening to a shared sense of possibility. The furniture of the city, the courthouse steps, the library stairs, the market stalls, no longer feels like edges of a battlefield, but rather the nerves of a living organism that can heal. The city's memory is no longer a scar, but a living archive of decisions that matter, the ones that protect the vulnerable, the ones that offer avenues to justice, the ones that honor every life. A child reaches up toward the mural that has grown since that earlier day, a mural that began as a witness and became a teacher. The image now contains the faces of new voices, parents whose faces show fatigue but also fierce resolve, students whose eyes say they've learned to expect justice, and elders who remind everyone that the arc of history bends toward humility when communities choose to learn. The mural is not a boast. It's a map of the future they will build, brick by brick, story by story. Isla looks out and sees a town that has learned to live in the light of accountability without losing its warmth. She sees Brant Lear not as a symbol of the worst parts of a badge, but as a man who once wore fear like armor and now marches forward with an earned humility. He has joined the quiet ranks of those who must keep choosing to repair, to listen, to change. He is not a flawless man. He is a work in progress, a living testament to the possibility that conscience can grow stronger than pride. The day's rhetoric is steady, not sensational. The speakers do not seek to inflame, they seek to repair. The city staff announces ongoing audits, new whistleblower protections, and a public portal where residents can report concerns with anonymity and dignity. The Civilian Oversight Board, now firmly rooted in city governance, releases its quarterly report, progress cataloged, failures acknowledged, lessons incorporated. The city reads it like a map, not a manifesto, and follows it with everyday acts of courage. In a quiet corner of the harbor's edge, a family sits on a bench beneath a beacon that glows like a lighthouse in human form. A mother explains to her child that a city becomes strong not by silencing fear, but by inviting its truth to the table. The child nods and asks if the table can feel heavy sometimes. The mother answers that it does, but that weight means care is alive, and care is worth fighting for. This is how the city becomes a classroom for morale, courage, and communal growth. Night falls over the harbor with a gentleness that feels almost ceremonial. The air is cooler, the water's surface shines, and the skyline glows with the soft tinge of city lights. Isla stands at the edge of the boardwalk, watching the boats bob in the harbor, listening to the quiet sounds of renewal. She feels the truth she's learned. Not every case ends with a victory in court, but every act of bravery, every stand for dignity, matters because it changes someone's life. In the end, the real victory is not a single verdict or a single dislodged badge. It is a shared discipline, an everyday vow to treat every citizen with respect, to listen before rushing to judgment, to correct errors before they become scars. The city has learned that justice is not a moment. It is a practice, a habit, a daily choice that asks us to keep choosing courage, even when fear returns. And as the sun rises over Fairhaven again, the harbor glows with a new promise. Justice, practiced daily, saves lives in the city's soul.